My name is Hannah and I'm 26 years old. If you've ever been judged by family members who thought they knew your worth better than you did, if you've ever been made to feel small for giving from the heart instead of from your wallet, and then had someone you loved defend you in the most unexpected way, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what happened at my grandfather's funeral changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and what really matters. You need to hear this story. I grew up in a small town in rural Vermont, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where fall brings tourists up from Boston and New York to see the leaves change colors, where winter means being snowed in for days at a time, and where the smell of wood smoke and maple syrup seems permanently woven into the air. The town sits in a valley surrounded by mountains that turn brilliant shades of red and gold every October, with a main street that looks like it hasn't changed since the 1950s. All brick buildings and local shops, and a diner that's been run by the same family for 3 generations. It's beautiful in that quintessential New England way, but it's also a hard place to make a living, with limited opportunities and young people leaving as soon as they graduate high school, heading to bigger cities where jobs actually exist. My grandfather, William Barrett, had lived in that town his entire life. He'd grown up during the Depression, the son of a logger who worked the forests that covered the mountains, learning early that life was hard and survival required grit and resourcefulness. He'd served in the Korean War, come home and married my grandmother, bought a small farm on the outskirts of town where they raised dairy cows and grew vegetables, and somehow managed to raise 4 children on income that was always precarious. The farm was never profitable in any real sense, but it kept them fed and gave them a place to belong, a piece of land that was theirs in a world that didn't give people like them very much. My father was the youngest of those 4 children, and he'd followed the family pattern, staying in town, working construction and odd jobs, marrying my mother, who was a teacher's aide at the elementary school. They had me and my younger brother in a small house about 2 miles from my grandparents' farm, and we grew up spending almost as much time at that farm as we did in our own home. My grandfather was the center of our family's universe, the person everyone gathered around, the one whose stories and wisdom and quiet strength held us all together. He taught me how to milk cows when I was barely tall enough to reach, how to drive a tractor when I was 12, how to tap maple trees and boil sap into syrup every spring. He taught me about hard work and about finding joy in simple things, about the satisfaction of growing your own food and fixing things instead of replacing them. He had this way of making you feel valuable, like your presence mattered, like the time you spent with him was a gift he treasured. I loved him more than almost anyone in the world, and I knew he loved me too, even though he wasn't the type to say it out loud very often. It was understood, felt in the way he'd save the first ripe tomato of summer for me, the way he'd ask about my life and actually listen to the answers, the way his whole face would light up when I'd show up at the farm unexpectedly. My father's siblings had taken different paths. His oldest brother, my Uncle Robert, had left Vermont after college, moved to Connecticut and built a successful career in finance. He'd married a woman from a wealthy family, lived in a massive house in an exclusive suburb, and had 2 children, my cousins Jason and Madison, who'd grown up with every advantage money could provide. Uncle Robert visited Vermont maybe twice a year, always seeming vaguely uncomfortable in his childhood home, like he'd outgrown it and didn't quite know how to fit back into the space he'd left behind. My grandfather was always happy to see him, but there was a distance there. A gap created by years and choices and fundamentally different values. My Aunt Patricia had moved to Boston, worked in marketing, married and divorced twice, had no children, and visited even less frequently than Uncle Robert. And my Aunt Susan had stayed in Vermont but moved to Burlington, the biggest city in the state, working as a nurse and maintaining closer ties with my grandfather even though she lived an hour away. The family dynamics were complicated, with resentments and judgments running beneath the surface of every gathering. The siblings who'd left feeling superior to those who'd stayed feeling abandoned by those who'd left, and my grandfather trying to love all of them equally despite their differences. I'd left Vermont too, but not by choice, not really. After high school, I'd gone to the University of Vermont in Burlington, studying education because I wanted to teach, because I'd grown up seeing my mother's impact on kids who needed someone to believe in them. I'd graduated with my bachelor's degree and massive student loan debt, found a teaching position at an elementary school in Burlington, and been living there for the past 4 years, teaching 2nd grade and barely making ends meet on a teacher's salary that was somehow supposed to cover rent and student loans and basic living expenses. I loved my job, loved my students, but I was broke basically all the time, living in a tiny apartment with 2 roommates, driving a car that was old when I bought it and was now actively dying, eating a lot of pasta and rice because that's what I could afford. I visited my grandfather as often as I could, driving the hour from Burlington to the farm on weekends when I wasn't buried in lesson planning and grading. After my grandmother died 3 years ago, those visits became even more important. My grandfather aged noticeably after her death, the loss of his partner of 56 years creating a hole in his life that none of us could fill. He kept working the farm as much as he could, but it was too much for one 87-year-old man, and eventually my father convinced him to sell the dairy cows and keep just a few chickens and a garden. The farm felt emptier after that, haunted by the life it used to hold, but my grandfather stayed there stubbornly, refusing to move into town or into assisted living, insisting he'd die on his land the way he'd lived on it. Last October, during peak foliage season when Vermont was at its most beautiful and tourists clogged every road, my grandfather had a stroke. My father found him collapsed in the barn, rushed him to the hospital and called all of us with the news. I drove down immediately, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and spent the next week basically living at the hospital, sitting beside his bed holding his hand, talking to him even though he couldn't really respond. The stroke had been severe, affecting his speech and mobility, and the doctors were honest that recovery at his age would be minimal at best. Uncle Robert flew in from Connecticut, stayed for 2 days and flew back out, needing to get back to work. Aunt Patricia came for an afternoon, cried dramatically and left. Aunt Susan visited daily, her nursing background making her the one who could actually talk to the doctors and understand what they were saying. My grandfather came home after 2 weeks, with hospice care arranged and everyone understanding that this was the beginning of the end. He'd made it clear years ago that he didn't want extreme measures, didn't want to die in a hospital, wanted to be on his farm for whatever time he had left. My father took a leave from work to be there full time, and I started driving down every day after school, staying until late at night, sleeping on the couch and driving back to Burlington at 5 in the morning to make it to school on time. It was exhausting and heartbreaking, watching this strong man who'd taught me so much become frail and confused, struggling to communicate, clearly frustrated by his body's betrayal. But there were moments of clarity too, times when he'd squeeze my hand and look at me with recognition and love, times when he'd try to tell me something important even though the words wouldn't come out right. I'd sit beside his bed and tell him about my students, about the funny things they'd said that day, about the projects we were working on, and I could see him listening, see him finding joy in these small stories even as he was dying. I'd play him music, the old country songs he'd always loved, and sometimes he'd try to hum along. I'd show him photos on my phone of the farm in different seasons, reminding him of all the beauty he'd created and maintained, and I'd see tears in his eyes. 3 weeks after he came home, on a cold November morning with the first snow of the season falling softly outside, my grandfather died. My father was with him and he called me at school, his voice breaking as he told me. I made it through the rest of the school day somehow, holding it together for my students because that's what teachers do. And then I drove to the farm and fell apart in my father's arms in the kitchen where I'd eaten 1,000 meals, where my grandfather had taught me to make his mother's biscuit recipe, where so many memories lived in every corner. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday, giving time for family to travel and arrangements to be made. My grandfather had left specific instructions with his lawyer, a man named Mr. Patterson who'd been his friend for 40 years, about what he wanted. Simple service at the Congregational church in town where he'd attended sporadically over the years, burial beside my grandmother in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley, a reception afterward at the church basement with food provided by the ladies' auxiliary. No fuss, no expensive casket, no elaborate flowers. He'd saved a little money specifically for this, not wanting to burden anyone with the costs, and he'd written out his wishes clearly so there'd be no confusion or family arguments. I spent that week in a fog, teaching my classes on autopilot, crying in my car during lunch breaks, trying to figure out what to wear to the funeral because I didn't own anything appropriate and couldn't afford to buy something new. I ended up borrowing a simple black dress from one of my roommates, too big on me but decent enough. But the clothes weren't what kept me up at night. What haunted me was the question of what to bring, what gift or token or gesture could possibly express what my grandfather had meant to me. There's a tradition in my family of bringing something to place in the casket, a personal item or letter or photo that goes with the person into the ground. When my grandmother died, people had brought all kinds of things. Uncle Robert had brought an expensive silk scarf he'd bought specifically for the occasion. Aunt Patricia had written an elaborate letter on fancy stationery. My cousins had brought store-bought items, jewelry and mementos that looked impressive. I'd been younger then, less aware of how these gestures could become a kind of competition, a way for people to perform their grief and their love in ways that could be measured and compared. For my grandfather, I wanted to bring something meaningful, something that represented our relationship and the things he'd taught me. I thought about it obsessively, lying awake at night, rejecting idea after idea as not quite right. And then 3 days before the funeral, I was in my classroom after school, preparing materials for the next week, and I saw the wooden box on my desk where I kept supplies. My grandfather had made me that box when I'd graduated from college, a simple rectangular container with a hinged lid, made from maple wood from his property. He'd sanded it smooth and finished it with care, and he'd burned my initials into the lid with a wood-burning tool. It wasn't fancy or expensive, just a functional object made with love and skill, and I used it every single day. Looking at that box, I suddenly knew what I needed to make. I left school, drove to a craft store and bought wood-burning tools and a small piece of maple wood. I spent the next 2 evenings in my apartment working late into the night, creating something I hoped would be worthy. I made a small wooden bookmark about 6 inches long and 2 inches wide, sanded smooth and carved carefully with a wood-burning tool. On one side I burned the words, "For Papa, who taught me that the best things in life are made with your own hands." On the other side I burned a simple design of a maple leaf and a small farmhouse. The work was amateur, nowhere near as skilled as my grandfather's craftsmanship, but it was made with the techniques he'd taught me, using tools like the ones he'd used, creating something with my own hands the way he'd always encouraged. I finished it the night before the funeral, my fingers blistered and sore, and I treated the wood with the same finish my grandfather had used on the box he'd made me, letting it dry overnight. It wasn't expensive, probably cost me less than $15 in materials, and it wasn't professionally made or particularly impressive to look at. But it was personal, created specifically for him, representing the skills he'd passed down and the values he'd instilled. I wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and tucked it into my purse, hoping it would be enough, hoping no one would judge me for bringing something so simple. The funeral was on a gray November day, cold and damp with low clouds hanging over the mountains, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones. The church was full, packed with people from town who'd known my grandfather for decades, farmers and shopkeepers and neighbors, along with family who'd traveled from various places. Uncle Robert was there with his wife Margaret and my cousins Jason and Madison, all of them dressed expensively, looking out of place among the local people in their modest church clothes. Aunt Patricia arrived late, making an entrance, her designer clothes and dramatic makeup drawing attention. Aunt Susan came early, helping to organize things, her nursing efficiency channeling her grief into useful action. The service was simple and moving, with the minister talking about my grandfather's life, his service in the war, his decades of hard work on the farm, his devotion to my grandmother, his love for his family. Several people from town stood up to share memories, stories about times my grandfather had helped them with repairs or shared produce from his garden or offered quiet support during their own hard times. I cried through most of it, my father's arm around my shoulders, my mother holding my hand, all of us united in grief and loss. After the service, we filed past the casket for final goodbyes before it would be closed for burial. This was when people placed their tokens and letters and gifts, their final offerings to the person they'd lost. I watched Uncle Robert place an expensive watch in the casket, mentioning loudly enough for people nearby to hear that it was a Rolex, that he wanted his father to have something valuable. Aunt Patricia placed a framed photo of herself with my grandfather, taken during one of her rare visits, along with a letter she'd written on embossed stationery. Aunt Susan placed a small Bible that had belonged to my grandmother, a genuinely thoughtful gift that represented something meaningful. Then my cousins came forward. Jason, who was 28 and worked in finance like his father, placed an expensive pen set in the casket, the kind that comes in a leather case and costs hundreds of dollars. Madison, who was 25 and worked in fashion in New York, placed a cashmere scarf, folded carefully to display the designer label. They both stood there for a moment, performing their grief for the audience, making sure everyone saw what they'd brought. When it was my turn, I approached the casket with my small wrapped package, my hands shaking. I stood there looking at my grandfather's face, so still and unlike him, and I felt the weight of everything unsaid, all the gratitude and love that I'd never adequately expressed. I placed the wooden bookmark on his chest right over his heart, and whispered that I loved him, that I'd try to remember everything he'd taught me, that I'd miss him every single day. My fingers lingered on the wood for a moment and then I stepped back, wiping tears from my face. I heard it then, a snort of barely suppressed laughter from behind me. I turned and saw Madison covering her mouth, her eyes meeting Jason's with a look of shared amusement. As I walked past them back to my seat, Madison leaned toward her brother and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Did you see what she brought? Looks like a craft project from summer camp." I guess that's all she could afford on a teacher's salary. Jason snickered and whispered back, "Probably made it herself." How embarrassing. Papa deserved better than homemade garbage at his funeral. Margaret, their mother, shushed them half-heartedly, but I saw her lips pressed together in a way that suggested she agreed with the assessment. Other family members nearby had heard too, and I saw them glancing at me with pity or judgment, comparing my simple handmade bookmark to the expensive items others had brought. My face burned with humiliation. I felt like a child who'd failed to understand the assignment, who'd shown up to a formal event in the wrong clothes, who'd revealed her poverty and inadequacy for everyone to see. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I'd made it with love, with skills my grandfather had taught me, that it meant something even if it wasn't expensive. But my throat was tight with tears and anger and grief all tangled together and I couldn't speak. I just sat down next to my parents, staring at my hands, feeling the weight of judgment from the family members who'd always had more money, more success, more of everything except time with the man we were burying. The service concluded and we moved outside for the burial. The cemetery was on a hillside overlooking the valley, bare trees stark against the gray sky, the ground hard with approaching winter. They lowered the casket into the earth beside my grandmother's grave, and the minister said the final prayers, and it was done. My grandfather was gone, returned to the land he'd worked his entire life. People stood around in clusters afterward, talking in the subdued voices people use at gravesides, making plans to meet at the church for the reception. Uncle Robert announced that there would be a reading of the will at my grandfather's house after the reception, that Mr. Patterson the lawyer would be handling it, and that all immediate family members should plan to attend. This caused some murmuring as people were curious about what my grandfather might have left behind. The farm had value even if it wasn't particularly profitable, just as land in Vermont with a house and barn and mountain views. And my grandfather had been careful with money his whole life, living simply, not spending much. There might be savings, people speculated, maybe more than anyone expected. The reception at the church was the usual funeral gathering, plates of sandwiches and casseroles brought by church ladies, coffee urns and desserts spread across tables covered in plastic tablecloths. People told stories about my grandfather, shared memories, offered condolences to those of us closest to him. I mostly stood in corners, still stinging from my cousin's mockery, not trusting myself to be social without breaking down. My father noticed and came to check on me, asking if I was okay, and I told him I was fine, just tired, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. Madison found me near the dessert table, where I was pushing a piece of cake around my plate without eating it. She came up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said she hoped I wasn't upset about her comment earlier, that she hadn't meant anything by it. She said she thought it was sweet that I'd made something very crafty and creative, exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from an elementary school teacher. Her tone made it clear that sweet and crafty were not compliments, that she was offering a non-apology that actually reinforced the insult. I told her it was fine, my voice flat, and excused myself to go to the bathroom, where I locked myself in a stall and cried quietly for 5 minutes before pulling myself together. After the reception, immediate family members drove to my grandfather's farm for the will reading. The house felt wrong without him in it, empty and cold despite the fire my father had built in the wood stove. We gathered in the living room, the same room where I'd spent countless hours over the years, playing cards at the old table, listening to my grandfather's stories, learning to knit from my grandmother. Now it was filled with family members perched on furniture and folding chairs my father had brought in, everyone waiting to see what my grandfather had left behind and who would get what. Mr. Patterson arrived with his briefcase, looking somber and official in his dark suit. He'd known my grandfather for decades, had helped him with various legal matters over the years, and I could see genuine grief in his eyes as he looked around the room. He greeted everyone formally, expressed his condolences again, and then got down to business. He explained that my grandfather's will was straightforward, that he'd been very clear about his wishes, and that everything had been properly documented and witnessed. He pulled out a folder of papers and began reading in his lawyer voice, formal and clear. The first items were simple. My grandfather left his truck to my father, his tools to my Uncle Robert even though Robert would probably never use them, various pieces of furniture and household items distributed among his children. He left his wedding ring to Aunt Susan, asking her to give it to whichever of her sons decided to marry first, so the ring could continue in the family. He left a small amount of money, about $5,000, to be divided equally among his 4 children, barely enough to matter but a gesture of trying to be fair. And then Mr. Patterson paused, looking down at the papers in his hand with an expression I couldn't quite read. He said that my grandfather had included personal notes for several family members, that he'd spent time in the weeks before his stroke writing these messages, apparently knowing his time was limited and wanting to leave certain thoughts behind. Mr. Patterson said he'd read them aloud as my grandfather had requested, even though some were personal, because my grandfather had felt it was important for the whole family to hear them. He started with a note for Uncle Robert, thanking him for his success and hoping he'd find time to visit Vermont more often, to remember where he came from. Uncle Robert nodded, looking uncomfortable. There was a note for Aunt Patricia, gentle and forgiving, acknowledging that life hadn't always been kind to her and expressing hope that she'd find peace. She wiped tears from her eyes, her dramatic makeup smearing. Then Mr. Patterson pulled out another piece of paper, this one longer, and he said my grandfather had written specifically about the funeral, about the tradition of family members leaving items in the casket. I felt my stomach drop, suddenly terrified that he'd been disappointed by what I'd brought, that even he had wished for something better than my homemade bookmark. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and began reading, and my grandfather's voice seemed to fill the room, his words careful and deliberate in the way he'd always spoken. The note said, "I've been thinking about what people might bring to my funeral, what tokens and gifts and gestures they'll make. I know my family, know there will be expensive things and elaborate presentations, people trying to show their love through the cost of what they bring. I want to say something about that while I still can, because it matters to me that you all understand. The most valuable gift anyone could bring me isn't something bought from a store or chosen because it looks impressive. The most valuable gift is something made with your own hands, something that required time and thought and skill, something that represents the values I tried to teach you all your lives." Mr. Patterson paused and I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. My face went hot, my heart pounding as he continued reading. My granddaughter Hannah has always understood this. She learned to work with her hands, to create instead of just consume, to value craftsmanship and effort over price tags. I know she's struggled financially, making the choice to teach children instead of chasing money, living modestly so she can do work that matters. I know her family sometimes looks down on her for not being as financially successful as others, for not having the expensive things that seem to matter so much to people who've forgotten what real value looks like. The room was completely silent now, everyone frozen, listening. Madison's face had gone pale, Jason was staring at the floor, and Uncle Robert looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Mr. Patterson kept reading, his voice steady. "I've watched Hannah over the years, seen her choose meaning over money, time with loved ones over career advancement, creativity and connection over material success. She embodies the values I tried to live by, the lessons I tried to teach. Whatever she brings to my funeral, no matter how simple it might seem to others, will be the most valuable gift I receive, because it will come from someone who truly understood me and what I believed mattered in life." There was more, my grandfather going on to say that he hoped his family would learn from Hannah's example, that they'd remember that wealth isn't measured in dollars, that the things we make and the time we share and the love we show through small gestures matter infinitely more than expensive purchases. He said he was proud of all his children and grandchildren, but that Hannah had grown into exactly the kind of person he'd hoped his legacy would create, someone who valued the right things and lived according to principles that would last long after money and possessions had turned to dust. When Mr. Patterson finished reading, the silence in the room was suffocating. I was crying openly now, overwhelmed by my grandfather's words, by the fact that he'd seen me and valued me in ways I'd never fully realized. My father reached over and squeezed my hand, tears running down his own face. My mother had her arm around me, holding me tight. And the family members who'd judged me, who'd mocked my simple gift, who'd dismissed my choices as failures, Sat there confronted with the truth that the person whose opinion mattered most had rejected their values entirely. Madison looked like she wanted to disappear. Jason couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Margaret was very still, her face carefully blank. Uncle Robert cleared his throat and said something awkward about how Papa had always been sentimental, trying to diffuse the tension, but no one responded. Aunt Patricia was crying and I couldn't tell if it was grief or shame or both. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the wood stove and my own shaky breathing as I tried to process what had just happened. Mr. Patterson wasn't done. He said my grandfather had left one final bequest, this one not mentioned in the will but arranged separately through a trust. He looked directly at me and said that my grandfather had left me $20,000, money he'd been saving for years, with specific instructions that it was to be used to pay down my student loans. He'd written that he knew education was expensive, that teachers were undervalued and underpaid, and that he didn't want me burdened by debt for choosing a career that served others. The money was mine, no strings attached, a gift from someone who'd valued my choices even when they made my life harder. I couldn't speak. $20,000 was more money than I'd ever had at once, enough to eliminate almost half my student loan debt, enough to give me breathing room I'd never had in my adult life. It was such a generous gift, especially from someone who'd lived modestly his whole life, who'd saved every penny. And he'd given it to me, the granddaughter who'd brought a homemade bookmark to his funeral, who worked a job that barely paid rent, who'd chosen meaning over money at every turn. The family meeting broke up shortly after, people leaving quickly, the awkwardness too thick to endure. Madison and Jason left without saying goodbye to me, their parents hustling them out to their rental car. Aunt Patricia hugged me briefly, whispering that Papa had always loved me best, which felt like an attempt to bond over the moment but also revealed her own hurt at not being chosen. Aunt Susan stayed to help clean up, and she told me she was glad Papa had recognized what I meant to him, that she'd always known I was his favorite even if he'd tried not to show it. After everyone else left, I sat in my grandfather's living room with my parents, the three of us emotionally exhausted. My father told me stories about growing up on the farm, about learning to work with his hands from his own father, about the pride that came from creating things and fixing things and not needing to buy your way through life. He said he'd tried to pass those same values to me and my brother, and that he was proud I'd internalized them even when they made my life harder financially. My mother said she'd watched me struggle to make ends meet on a teacher's salary, had worried about me, but that she'd never doubted I was living according to what mattered most. We stayed until dark, walking through the house and the barn, remembering my grandfather in the spaces where he'd lived and worked. I stood in the workshop where he'd taught me to use his tools, where the maple box on my classroom desk had been created, where countless projects and repairs had been completed over the decades. I could almost feel him there, his presence in the worn handles of the tools, in the sawdust that still lingered in the corners, in the careful organization of nails and screws and pieces of wood saved because they might be useful someday. The drive back to Burlington that night was quiet, my mind replaying my grandfather's words over and over. He'd seen me. He'd understood what I was trying to do with my life, the choices I was making and why. And he'd validated those choices in the most public way possible, in front of the family members who judged me, making it clear that their values and his were fundamentally different. The humiliation I'd felt when Madison mocked my gift had been transformed into vindication, proof that I'd understood the assignment perfectly even if others hadn't. The $20,000 changed my immediate financial situation dramatically. I paid off a huge chunk of my student loans, watched that monthly payment drop, suddenly had money left over at the end of each month instead of scraping by on overdraft protection and credit cards. I bought a reliable used car to replace the one that was dying, cried in the dealership when I realized I could actually afford something safe and functional. I built up a small emergency fund, that financial cushion I'd never had before, the security of knowing I could handle an unexpected expense without panic. But more than the money, my grandfather's words changed how I thought about my choices. I'd been carrying this low-level shame about not being more successful financially, about not keeping up with cousins and friends who made more money and had nicer things. I'd been questioning whether teaching was sustainable long-term, whether I'd made a mistake choosing meaning over income. My grandfather's note, his explicit validation of my values and choices, gave me permission to stop apologizing for the life I'd built. I was living according to principles that mattered, and the fact that those principles didn't lead to wealth wasn't a failure. It was actually success of a different, more meaningful kind. I never heard from Madison or Jason after the funeral. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd said or how wrong they'd been. But I heard through family gossip that Madison had been mortified when she got back to New York, that she'd told her friends about the funeral and they'd thought her behavior was appalling, mocking someone's heartfelt gift at a funeral. Jason apparently had a similar experience, his girlfriend calling him out for being cruel and shallow. Whether they learned anything from it, I don't know. But I like to think that maybe my grandfather's words planted seeds, made them question their own values and priorities even if they'd never admit it. Uncle Robert sent me a brief email a few weeks after the funeral, saying he'd been thinking about what his father had written, about the difference between price and value, about what he'd prioritized in his own life. He didn't quite apologize for years of implicitly judging my choices, but he acknowledged that he'd lost something by leaving Vermont and chasing success, that his kids had grown up disconnected from the values his own father had tried to instill. It was the closest thing to self-awareness I'd ever seen from him, and while it didn't repair our relationship, it at least acknowledged that maybe there were different ways to measure a life well lived. The farm was sold the following spring to a young couple who wanted to start a small organic farm, and my father negotiated a deal that let them buy it for less than market value because he knew that's what his father would have wanted, the land going to people who'd work it and love it rather than developers who'd subdivide it. Part of the sale money went to settling my grandfather's small remaining debts and covering final expenses, and the rest was divided among his 4 children as specified in the will. My father used his portion to finally retire from construction, his body worn out from decades of physical labor. He spent his retirement doing woodworking, creating furniture and small items using the tools his father had left him, discovering late in life the satisfaction of making beautiful things with his own hands. I'm 29 now, still teaching 2nd grade, still living modestly in Burlington, still driving the reliable used car I bought with my grandfather's gift. I paid off my student loans completely last year, a freedom I'd never quite believed would be possible. I kept the wooden bookmark, of course, never placed it in the casket as I'd intended. After my grandfather's note was read, after Mr. Patterson was done with all the official business, he'd quietly pulled me aside and given me the bookmark back. He said my grandfather had left instructions that if I brought something handmade to the funeral, it should be photographed and placed in the casket, but the original should be returned to me. He'd anticipated exactly what I would do, known me well enough to predict my choice, and arranged for me to keep the thing I'd made. That bookmark sits on my desk at home now, next to the maple box my grandfather made for me, both of them reminders of what matters. I use them every day, these simple wooden objects created with care and skill, worth almost nothing in monetary terms but priceless in meaning. They represent a legacy that has nothing to do with money, a set of values passed down through generations, the belief that the best things in life are made with your own hands and shared with people you love. I think about my grandfather often, about the lessons he taught through decades of patient example. He showed me that hard work has dignity regardless of the paycheck it produces. He taught me that creativity and craftsmanship are valuable skills worth developing even if they never make you rich. He demonstrated that time with loved ones, attention given freely, presence in the moment, these are the things that create a life of meaning. And in his final note, read aloud at his funeral in front of the whole family, he validated every choice I'd made that others had questioned, every time I'd chosen substance over appearance, meaning over money, love over prestige. The irony of my cousins mocking my cheap gift, only to have my grandfather's lawyer read a note praising that exact gift as the most valuable thing he'd receive, is almost too perfect. It's the kind of dramatic vindication you'd reject as unrealistic if you read it in a novel, the universe serving up justice so perfectly timed it seems orchestrated. But it happened, every bit of it, and I'm grateful for all of it, even the painful moment of mockery, because it set up the revelation that followed, the public validation that meant everything. My grandfather's last gift to me wasn't just the money, though that changed my life in practical ways. His last gift was the confirmation that I'd understood him, that I'd learned what he was teaching, that I was living according to values he believed mattered. He gave me permission to stop doubting myself, to stop measuring my worth by other people's standards, to trust that the path I'd chosen was valid and valuable even when it was hard. And he did it in a way that couldn't be dismissed or ignored, his words read aloud by a lawyer in front of the family members who judged me, making his position absolutely clear. I teach my 2nd graders about values now, about how worth isn't measured by cost, how the best gifts are often handmade, How creativity and effort matter more than expensive purchases. I show them the bookmark in the box, tell them about my grandfather, teach them basic woodworking skills in our classroom makerspace. I watch 7-year-olds carefully sand pieces of wood, burn simple designs with supervised tools, create gifts for their parents that cost almost nothing but mean everything. And I see their faces light up when they realize they can make beautiful things with their own hands, that they don't need money to create value, that their effort and love and attention are enough. Some of my students come from wealthy families, others from families struggling to make ends meet, but in my classroom, those differences don't determine worth. The child who brings in a handmade card for my birthday isn't less valued than the child whose parents buy an expensive gift. Actually, I treasure the handmade cards more, keep them in a special folder because they represent time and thought and care in ways a purchased item never can. I'm teaching them what my grandfather taught me, and I see the seeds taking root, these children learning young that there are different ways to measure success and value. Last month, one of my students, a little girl named Emma from a family that's been homeless twice this year, made me a bookmark for Teacher Appreciation Week. She'd used a popsicle stick, some yarn and markers, creating this simple, slightly crooked thing with "Best Teacher" written in her careful second-grade handwriting. She gave it to me shyly, apologizing that it wasn't fancy, that her mom didn't have money for a real gift. I held that popsicle stick bookmark and told her it was the most beautiful gift I'd received all week, that I could see how much care she'd put into making it, that it would go in my special place at home with the most important things I own. I brought it home and put it on my desk next to my grandfather's maple box and the bookmark I'd made for him, this collection of simple handmade objects that tell the story of what I value and who I've learned from. Emma's bookmark sits there now, a reminder that the lessons keep passing forward, that every time I honor creativity and effort over cost, every time I validate a child's handmade gift instead of dismissing it as less than store-bought alternatives, I'm continuing what my grandfather started, keeping alive a way of seeing the world that the Madisons and Jasons of the world will never understand. I went back to my grandfather's grave last fall on the anniversary of his death, when the mountains were blazing with color and the air had that crisp edge that means winter's coming. I brought flowers from my own garden, grown from seeds using techniques he'd taught me, and I sat on the cold ground beside his headstone and talked to him the way I used to when he was alive. I told him about my students, about the life I was building, about how his words at the funeral had changed everything for me. I told him I was happy, genuinely happy, even though I'd never be rich, even though I'd probably never own a house or take fancy vacations or have the kind of success that impresses people at parties. Sitting there in the cemetery overlooking the valley he'd loved, I realized that my grandfather had given me something more valuable than money or property or anything material. He'd given me a framework for understanding what matters, a set of values that would guide me through every decision for the rest of my life. He'd shown me that you can live with integrity and meaning even when the world tells you to chase wealth and status. He'd demonstrated that the opinion that matters most is your own, that you have to live according to principles you believe in regardless of who judges you for it. The bookmark I made for him, the one that came back to me, represents all of this. It's not much to look at, this simple piece of wood with burned lettering and a crude design. But it holds within it everything my grandfather taught me about value and worth and what it means to live a meaningful life. It's proof that I understood the lessons, that I'm carrying forward what he tried to pass on, that his legacy lives in the choices I make every single day. My cousin Madison got married last year to someone who works in private equity, and the wedding was featured in a style magazine, all designer details and expensive flowers and a venue that probably cost more than I'll make in 5 years. I saw the photos on social media, this elaborate display of wealth and taste, and I felt nothing but a mild curiosity about whether she was actually happy beneath all that expensive production. We've never spoken about the funeral, about what she said or what my grandfather wrote. The gulf between us is too wide now, our values too different, and I've accepted that some family relationships exist only in shared history, not in present connection. But I stay close to my father, visiting him regularly, learning more woodworking skills in his retirement workshop, working on projects together the way he used to work with his father. We don't talk much while we work, just exist comfortably in shared space, the sound of tools and the smell of sawdust creating a meditation that connects us across generations. He's teaching me advanced techniques now, joinery and finishing, and how to see the potential in a piece of raw wood. And I'm carrying forward what both he and my grandfather taught me, these skills and values that have nothing to do with money and everything to do with meaning. I've started a side project, making simple wooden items and selling them at local craft fairs, not because I need the money but because I love the work and the connection it creates with people who appreciate handmade things. I make boxes and bookmarks and cutting boards, small functional objects crafted with care, priced to cover materials in a little time but not much more. People who buy them always comment on the quality, the attention to detail, the fact that you can feel the care that went into making them. And I tell them about my grandfather, about learning these skills from him, about the values he passed down. My small business is called Barrett Woodworks, using my grandfather's name, honoring his legacy with every piece I create. The money isn't significant, maybe a few $1,000s a year, but that's not why I do it. I do it because creating beautiful functional objects with my own hands connects me to my grandfather, keeps his teachings alive in my daily practice, reminds me that there are ways of being in the world that resist the constant pressure to consume and acquire and measure worth in dollars. Every box I make, every bookmark I craft, is a small act of resistance against values I don't share, a quiet insistence that there are other ways to live. I'm teaching my younger brother these same skills now. He's 23, just graduated from college, trying to figure out what kind of life he wants to build. He's been offered high-paying jobs in tech and finance, positions that would give him the kind of success Uncle Robert achieved, the wealth and status that our extended family values so highly. But he's hesitating, feeling the pull of something different, something more aligned with meaning than money. We talk about it while working in our father's shop, sanding wood and planning projects, and I share what I've learned about choosing values over valuables, about building a life that feels authentic even when it's not impressive by conventional standards. I don't know what he'll choose, and I tell him there's no wrong answer, that he has to live according to what feels right for him. But I also tell him about the funeral, about Madison's mockery and grandfather's note, about the moment when my simple handmade gift was revealed to be exactly what mattered most. I tell him that the family members who seemed most successful were also the ones most disconnected from what our grandfather valued, that wealth and meaning don't necessarily go together, that sometimes you have to choose. And I watch him process this, see him weighing options and considering what kind of person he wants to become. Whatever he decides, I know I've given him the gift my grandfather gave me. A framework for thinking about value that goes beyond price tags, a set of questions to ask about what matters and why, permission to choose differently than what the culture insists is success. That's the real inheritance, not money or property but a way of seeing and being in the world. And it's the kind of inheritance that grows rather than depletes, that strengthens with passing forward, that becomes more valuable the more it's shared. I keep the lawyer's copy of my grandfather's funeral note in a frame on my bedroom wall now, reading it whenever I need reminding of who I am and what I value. The words never lose their power, never stop making me cry, never fail to reconnect me with the man who saw me so clearly and loved me so completely. The most valuable gift anyone could bring me isn't something bought from a store or chosen because it looks impressive. The most valuable gift is something made with your own hands, something that required time and thought and skill, something that represents the values I tried to teach you all your lives. Those words are my North Star now, the measure I use for decisions big and small. When I'm tempted to buy something expensive to impress people, I remember what my grandfather valued. When I'm feeling inadequate because I don't have what others have, I remember that I have something more important. Integrity, creativity, values I actually believe in rather than just perform. When I'm exhausted from teaching and wondering if it's sustainable, I remember that doing work that matters to someone who saw clearly what mattered most is success of the highest order. So yes, at my grandfather's funeral, my cousin mocked my cheap gift in front of the whole family, made sure everyone knew I'd brought something homemade and simple while others had brought expensive purchases. She tried to humiliate me, to highlight my lack of money and status, to make me feel small for giving from the heart instead of from my wallet. And then the lawyer read my grandfather's last note, and everything she'd meant as an insult was revealed to be the highest compliment, the proof that I'd understood what everyone else had missed, the evidence that I was living according to values that would outlast any expensive watch or designer scarf. The vindication was perfect, the timing was flawless, and the lesson was clear. Worth isn't measured in dollars, love isn't proven by price tags, and the people who understand what really matters are often the ones the world dismisses as unsuccessful. My grandfather knew this, lived it, and used his final words to make sure I knew he'd seen me living it too. That knowledge, that validation, that gift of being truly seen and valued, is worth more than any inheritance of money or property could ever be. I'm 29 years old, teaching second grade in Burlington, Vermont, making modest wooden objects in my spare time, living in a small apartment with roommates, driving a used car, never going to be wealthy by anyone's conventional measure. And I'm happy, genuinely deeply happy, in ways I don't think my cousin Madison with her designer wedding and private equity husband will ever understand. Because I know what matters, I know what my life is built on. I know that when I die someday, the people who love me will remember the time I gave them, the things I made for them, the attention and care I offered, not the price tags of gifts I bought. That's my grandfather's legacy, and it's the greatest gift he could have given me. Not the $20,000, though that helped immensely. Not the validation in front of the family, though that healed something deep. The greatest gift was the framework for living, the permission to value what I value, the example of a life lived with integrity and meaning regardless of what others thought. And every time I pick up a piece of wood and begin to shape it into something useful and beautiful, every time I choose meaning over money or time over status, every time I validate a student's handmade gift instead of dismissing it, I'm honoring that legacy, passing it forward, keeping alive a way of being in the world that matters infinitely more than wealth or prestige or the approval of people who measure worth in dollars. If you made it all the way to the end of my story, thank you for being here with me through every moment. If my grandfather's message resonated with you, if you've ever felt judged for not measuring up to someone else's definition of success, I'd love if you'd leave a like on this video. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. And if you stuck around until the very end, drop a comment saying, "This message was for me," so I know you were here, really here, understanding what this story means. There are so many more stories about finding your worth and living according to what truly matters waiting to be told. So if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button. There's another story coming up next that I think will touch your heart just as deeply, so I'll see you there.